So if you're just going to compress it and ice it, what you're doing is you're blocking all forms of inflammation. You're blocking the good stuff, you're blocking the bad stuff. And the result is it made the tendon ligament tissue as bad as anything that we've ever done.
Okay, welcome back to Fuelin Sessions. I'm Scott Tindal, your host, and unfortunately, Jan can't be with me today, and I'm sure he would have loved to have been here because we've got a powerhouse episode for every athlete who's serious about staying strong, healthy, and performing at their best. Joining me today is world-renowned Dr. Keith Baar, one of the world's top experts in tendon, muscle, and connective tissue science. His research has changed how athletes recover, train, and build stronger, more resilient bodies. He's authored over 160 peer-reviewed publications. And at Keith's request, and I'm very happy about this, Dr. Alec Avey, a rising star in tendon and ligament research who actually works alongside Dr. Keith Baar at UC Davis. Together, they're pushing the future of injury prevention and performance recovery. And with that, we're going to dive in to how simple isometrics can heal tendons, the real truth behind collagen, and whether or not blood flow restriction could be the next big game changer in your rehab. This is all about real world science-backed advice that you can apply immediately. If you've ever battled a tendon injury, and I can put my hand up there, and I'm sure many endurance athletes have, and wondered how to bulletproof your body, you're going to hear this exact information from world-leading experts. So let's get into it. Dr. Keith Baar and Dr. Alec Avey, welcome to Fuelin Sessions.
Thank you very much, Scott. It's great to be here. Thanks for including us.
Thanks, Scott. Excited to be here.
I'm very excited, and actually, Keith, the reason it's interesting because I was listening to your episode with Tim Ferriss actually, and I was like, I know that voice, and then I looked, and then I saw it was you, and then it brought back memories when I was at the Toronto Maple Leafs, and I remember reaching out to you because we had some issues with some tendons and things like that, and we had a really great conversation, and that was, that's back 2018. So I imagine the world has progressed in terms of rehabilitation, although we were using isometrics back then, but we're obviously going to talk a lot about that and how athletes can respond to a lot of the research that you've done. So I think, look, I've given you a very quick introduction, but why don't we start with you, Keith, and just give us a quick overview of who you are and sort of where you're at and why, we're going to be talking about tendons and collagen and everything else today.
Yeah, sure. So I'm obviously Professor Keith Baar. I'm at the University of California, Davis. I started as a good athlete in a lot of different sports, but not a great athlete in any one sport. And the result was I was trying to, for a long time, figure out why I wasn't a great athlete, because I really wanted to be a great athlete. And I couldn't get across the line. So I spent, I did an undergraduate at Michigan where I was a strength coach with the football team there. I did a master's at Berkeley and then a PhD at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And there, what I did was use a lot of what I learned as a strength coach to come up with a new model. And that allowed me to identify kind of these very small molecules, the molecular kind of targets of our strength training that help us increase our muscle mass. And I did a postdoc at Washington University in St. Louis, where we did a lot of work with endurance exercise and looked at kind of the molecular target of endurance exercise. We're figuring out these small molecules within our body that are responding to the different types of training we're doing. And now we can think of, okay, well, if I manipulate my training and nutrition this way, I can change that molecule, and that's going to allow me to get stronger or better endurance. So I went to Michigan as a postdoc to engineer muscles and to engineer them myself, genetically engineer them, but also build them in three-dimensional structure, because I thought I was going to be able to make these huge, big, strong, endurance-trained muscles. And the truth of it was I could make nothing bigger than about 1 millimeter across, because that's just how big you can engineer muscle. But we learned a lot about it, and we tried to make these little machines using the muscles that we engineered, and they always failed at the tendon, or at the interface between the machine, the plastic or the piece of metal that we were trying to drive, and the muscle that we had, because there wasn't a tendon, because we hadn't engineered it yet. And so when we started our first lab in Scotland, that was a lot of what we focused on, was kind of trying to understand the tendon, but then also understanding how other structures other than the muscle contribute to strength and to force. Because I learned along the way that a lot of athletes got a lot stronger without getting a lot bigger. And that's kind of against what the textbook says, which is the muscle strength is proportional to the mass or to the size of the muscle. And so a lot of that was about this idea of transmitting the force or transferring the force from the muscle to the bone to allow us to move. And that's where we've spent the last, say, 10 or 15 years. Alec's been with me for probably like 8 or 9 of those years. And we do a lot of stuff now where we engineer ligaments. We look at, study tendons and ligaments in vivo, both in humans, but also in model organisms, trying to figure out how our tendons develop, how we can make them stronger. Are there different things we can use, nutrition, drugs, or exercise to do to improve their functionality?
Yeah, I love it. It's probably, a lot of people are probably hearing that and going, oh my God, this is going to sound incredibly technical in terms of science and whatnot. But I assure you, as we get into this, what we're going to do is really break down a lot of the practicalities of exactly what Keith's been working on with Alec. And Alec, why don't you give us a brief overview of just who you are and what you've been working on?
Yeah, kind of feel like the guy following Tiger Woods off the tee, hearing those lists of accomplishments from Keith. But yeah, my journey, Keith kind of mentioned, my journey in this area of science started as an undergrad. I joined Keith's lab, found Keith's lab out of an interest in sports and personal experience with tendon injuries. Uh, from there, Keith actually kind of convinced me to go the graduate PhD route. That was not a plan I had, but he's been an incredible mentor, and I thought, why not? In my graduate work, I spent a lot of time focusing on inflammation, specifically related to tendon and ligament, which I think we're going to get into today. Part of my doctoral work towards the end was actually identifying a specific pro-inflammatory pathway that we can target that increases the size and strength of our tendons, which led me to kind of continuing in a postdoc role with Keith to continue to pursue that project because I think it has really the potential to kind of change the way we can treat tendon injuries. Along with that postdoc, I've started a business development fellowship at UC Davis with the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Institute here on campus, which has led kind of to my role as a co-founder with Keith in our very early stage startup, Sinuous, which we'll get into later. So I'm kind of dual rolling right now, my postdoc role with Keith, as well as kind of the role as a co-founder of a UC Davis startup.
Yeah, I love it. And we're certainly going to talk about that instrument and your business, because I'm actually very interested in it personally to hear how you're quantifying sort of loads. So, but I think, look, let's start at the very top. I think we're talking about tendons. You mentioned inflammation. There's probably a lot of misunderstanding around tendons and injuries and things like that. But why don't we just start with what is a tendon? Keith, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. That's the best place to start. So tendons are these rope-like structures, and they're really closely related to ligaments. So we consider them to be almost functionally the same when we're looking at it at a tissue level within the tissue. The big difference between them is a bone to bone connector is going to be a ligament. And the big difference between that and a tendon is attaching a muscle to a bone. And in that small difference, there's a huge, huge functional difference. That means that we're attaching something that's stretchy to something that's stiff for a tendon, and attaching two stiff things for a ligament. And functionally, what that means is the stronger and stiffer our ligaments are, the better they function. That means that the less movement there's going to be within that joint, and the result is the joint is going to work better, and it's going to not be lax, which would mean there's lots of movement there, which could lead to further ruptures and disruptions. A tendon, by contrast, it can't be stiff on both ends, because if you attach something that's really soft and squishy like a muscle to a bone, it has to start as being stretchy on one end and it has to become stiff on the other end. That's what its functional role is. And in that role, it plays this huge part in what we injure. So when we pull muscles, as specifically men pull muscles, because men pull muscles 70% more than women pull muscles. The reason that men pull muscles a lot is because the tendon becomes stiffer than the muscle is strong. And at the muscle end of the tendon, it's not stretchy enough to help the transmission of force from the muscle to the bone. So the way that a tendon is supposed to work, it's supposed to work like a shock absorber. Every time our muscle gets pulled on, the tendon is supposed to pull and release that energy in a way that protects that whole muscle from injury. When the tendon is too stiff, when I take a big long step, now that I'm crossing, say the hamstring muscle is crossing two joints that are both trying to stretch. Now, instead of the tendon stretching and allow the muscle to stay in this nice, safe region where it can protect itself from injury, now instead of that tendon stretching, now the muscle has to stretch. And when we try and stretch a muscle while we're producing a lot of force, that's called an eccentric load. A very fast eccentric load has got a lot of jerk associated with it. And that is when we get tendon injury or muscle pulls. So those are the two things that are really important. So a ligament, we want it to be as stiff as possible because it's connecting two stiff things. A tendon, we want it to be stiff on the bone end. We want it to be compliant or stretchy on the muscle end. And we play with the stretchiness on the muscle end by doing our training. If we train with lots of fast movements, the muscle end of the tendon becomes stiffer. If we train with lots of slow or heavy movements, where the muscle end of the tendon becomes less stiff. So what we're doing is we train to get faster. We're doing a lot of plyometric, very fast movements. The muscle end of the tendon gets stiffer. As we do that too much, now the muscle is more likely to get a pull. If we're doing lots of heavy strength training, that's going to make the muscle end of the tendon less stiff. And this is why strength training, heavy strength training, is the number one thing to decrease muscle injury, because that heavy strength training, there's a nice meta-analysis that showed that decreases muscle pulls by about 2/3. Okay, so when we lift heavy weights, it's going to make our muscle stronger, our tendon a little bit less stiff, and we're not going to get those muscle pulls.
And I know we will get into this when we talk about isometrics, because I've heard you talk about this. And you mentioned heavy loads, and obviously, I'm thinking back when the treatment for tendons really came on, and it was all about heavy loads. Is it the heavy load, or is it the time under tension?
So it's neither one particularly. So what it is, it's not that we have to put a lot of load through it. It's just that, and I know what you mean by time under tension, but we can develop time under tension in lots of different ways. I can do it as 10 1-second holds, or I can do it as 1 10-second holds. That's the same time under tension. But the 10 1-second holds aren't going to be as good for treating tendinopathy as the 1 10-second hold would be. Because what we're doing when we lift a heavy weight, or when we do any of these types of things, when we lift a heavy weight, we go slower. The slower we move, the better it is for our tendon health. The faster we move, the better it is for developing performance. Okay. And really, what we tend to do is we tend to go out and we tend to play sport where there's lots of fast moves. That's great. We're going to do that. But then what we do is we overdo it a little bit. And that's when we get the injury, and that's when we turn to a lot of what Alec's work is.
Yeah, and so if we then go, okay, so we've got the basic understanding of what a tendon is and then when they can become injured. And I guess there is that difference between that acute injury and then the chronic injury. And Alec, I guess the question for you will hear the term probably applied, and probably incorrectly so, with the tendonitis, which implies due to the itis, inflammation in the tendon. Does inflammation occur within the tendon, and what is the sort of period of time that an athlete would be looking at true inflammation occurring, if it does?
Yeah, so the general consensus with this is you're going to see inflammation after an acute injury within kind of a 24 to 72 hour window, right? So I think we've all experienced the rolled ankle, maybe playing basketball in the gym when haven't been playing basketball a lot and you take a wrong step, boom, rolled ankle, and it's really swollen the next day. That's your classic inflammatory response. And that's that acute response to injury that is actually, we believe, important and healthy. Where you kind of get into this chronic, and this is where, we can stay out of the weeds a bit. There's a lot of discourse on the role of inflammation in the chronic side. But the general consensus is you get some level of disruption in that healing process, whether it's within that first 72 hours where you have inflammation, or if it's in the next kind of days to weeks where inflammation is supposed to be resolving and you shift from this pro-inflammatory stage where you have increased blood flow, you have increased cellularity. So you're priming the tissue for recovery. And then you switch from this pro inflammatory stage to anti inflammatory, where you've now primed the tissue and you're ready to actually recover and rebuild. What we don't know yet, but what we kind of assume based on research in our own lab and across the literature, is that when you get in this chronic stage, you're having these repeat injuries where you're not actually giving yourself enough time to recover, um, classically called an overuse injury, right? And so what we get is we've partially recovered. Maybe we've started synthesizing new collagen. So we've taken a tissue, there's some damage, we've started to try to repair that damage, right? But we haven't actually, it's kind of like building a house, right? So we've put up the framing for the house, but we haven't then done the siding and the insulation, everything else, right? So we've started, but we haven't really finished building the house, and then we cause more damage. And so over time, our tissue's response is, instead of trying to repair that and organize our collagen, we create a scar. And what does a scar do for us? It allows us to continue going on with our lives, right? So if we think of it in terms of evolution, our body, our tendons, they don't know that I can go down to the store and get my dinner for the night, 15 minutes in the car and back, right? For our body, we're saying we need to be able to keep moving. We continue to do these repetitive motions that keep causing stress on the tendon. I'm going to create a scar here that allows me to kind of bypass that injured area and bring load around the scar through the healthy portions of the tendon. That allows us to keep going. It's not so great for the actual health of our tendon because we develop this chronic tendinopathy that now leaves us more likely to have a major injury in the future, right?
Okay. And that, so if I'm hearing what you're saying, and just to recap on that, that true inflammation can occur in the tendon with that acute injury. It can last, let's call it what, 73, maybe 4 days, maybe a little bit longer. I know there's always, it's always like when we talk about
Yes.
fat and carbohydrate oxidation, it's not like it stops at one point and then finishes. There's that sort of progression across. But, you know, I hear too often, I used to hear a lot from doctors, unfortunately, where they would look at a chronic tendon injury or issue and refer to it as a tendonitis. So that true tendonitis or inflammation within the tendon, what we're sort of saying, maybe 4 to 7 days of true inflammatory markers. Would that be accurate, or is that too long?
So in an ideal response, right, it's kind of in that 2 to 4 day window.
Really?
Again, where the discourse changes, and I think most commonly that's what you're seeing is the early inflammation, and then you have unresolved injury, and your body is not going to continue to have the inflammatory response. Now it's just packaging out collagen disorganized and saying, let's just do what we can to patch this hole and move on. There is, there was a study that found there was levels of inflammatory markers elevated in chronic Achilles tendinopathies. So, I'm a believer that what can happen is you have this chronic injury, and over time you may have attempts where your body does try to heal it again, and it has an inflammatory response, and so you might see elevated inflammation with a chronic injury. But generally, the thinking is, and you're going to have that initial inflammatory response, and that chronic tendinopathy is going to occur in the absence of absence of inflammation later.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense as well. Like if you've got a chronic tendon and then you go and do a heap of work on it, you're probably causing an acute injury on the chronic, which
Exactly.
probably then results in those acute markers coming up. I guess the real question probably a lot of people are asking then, okay, if there is this inflammation in a tendon in those first 4 days, do you do the traditional treatment, which would involve RICE, rest, ice, compression, elevation? And I can see Keith shaking his head, and I think I know the answer. And I was very much, I mean, look, even back in like 2006 when working in pro rugby, there was a real debate around whether you should apply ice to an acute injury. And I'd love to get both your takes on this.
Yeah, so let me have Alec go
Yeah,
first for the
yeah,
kind of inflammatory component, and then I'll talk from there.
yeah. So In terms of ice, there is, again, there's discourse and debate on whether ice really is an anti-inflammatory, and it has anti-inflammatory effects. But if we assume it does, right? I would say we don't want ice because in that acute response, if I'm gonna get a healthy response to injury, I need the inflammation. So ideally, I'm not using ice. Now, the trade off and the really difficult part, and I make jokes, I don't want to be an academic in my career, but you could make an academic career just out of figuring out the exact timing of when is inflammation good and up to what point is it suddenly not good, right? And ideally, if we knew that point, we could say, hey, ice would be great right about now. Unfortunately, we don't know that point. And then I think Keith can kind of dive more into this on why rice, especially, is extremely outdated.
Yeah. So again, and to just finish up with Alec and the work that he did, what he did is he actually blocked all inflammation. And there's two major pathways for inflammation. One is called NF kappa B, and one is called JAK-STAT. And why don't you tell him what happened when you block both of those?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time focusing on NF kappa B. This is really kind of in the literature the main driver. You can think of it as uh, the cool big brother that's very successful, and everyone cares about NF kappa B, right? And what we found was when I engineered ligaments and I treated with pro-inflammatory cytokines, NF kappa B activity went up and the function of our tissues went down. And we said, great, we've kind of replicated the negative response to inflammation. Now let's block it. So we block NF kappa B, and what do you know? The tendons get even worse. So completely blocking inflammation is just as bad, if not worse, than having prolonged chronic inflammation. So that kind of shifted us then to this other, what I call kind of the middle brother of inflammation, which is this JAK-STAT pathway. On PubMed, there's very little tendon JAK-STAT work. Most of it's focused again on NF kappa B. And what we found was actually in the presence of pro-inflammatory cytokines, so NF kappa B is still up. When we inhibit JAK1, so the JAK-STAT pathway, we get bigger, stronger, better ligaments. So again, it doesn't, we don't give a full picture, but within the scope of our work, it's telling us that inflammation a ton is bad, but completely blocking it is also horrible for your tendon or ligament.
Which would make sense in terms of applying high dose non-steroidals as well in the early stages of an injury, where it traditionally is done, and it's still done today, despite
Yep.
ongoing and emerging and probably more relevant information showing that that's actually horrendous at, say, day 28 or day 30 after, especially muscle injuries. I'm probably not as up to date on tendon injuries, but I imagine it's a similar sort of cascade, that it helps in the initial period, but then has detrimental effects down the line. Would that be correct?
Yeah, exactly. And so if you put it all together, then what you're doing when you ice is you're blocking all inflammation when it's not specific. So if you're just going to ice it, you're going to compress it and ice it. What you're doing is you're blocking all forms of inflammation. You're blocking the good stuff, you're blocking the bad stuff. And the result is, as Alex showed in his work, is when we block the one pathway, basically it made the tendon ligament tissue as bad as anything that we've ever done. And that's basically by blocking that inflammatory pathway. So we don't want to block inflammation in a way, especially not using pharmacological agents, using ice, using other things. It's going to actually have a potential negative effect. Now, if you do the other things that are involved in that, which are, immobilizing to some degree, we've got data that shows that I can produce a 20% decrease in collagen within 3 days of immobilization. So again, I always tell people, look, when you look at an immobilizer, the first recorded evidence of an immobilizer was in Egyptian paintings and hieroglyphs from 4,500 years ago. If you went to any other doctor who is treating you for anything and they were to propose to you to use a 4,500-year-old treatment, you would go to a different doctor immediately. And yet this is exactly what we do with orthopedic issues. We go in and we say, oh, well, there's this cool acronym, so I have to do it. So I'm going to rest, I'm going to ice, I'm going to compress, I'm going to elevate. All of those things that we're doing are exactly opposite to what we would say would be good things to do.
What
If
about
you
the
want to use,
compression? What about the
The
compression
compression is
element, though?
fine, but the compression doesn't do a whole lot, to be honest. If you want to do anti-inflammatory for a musculoskeletal injury, put load through it. Because every time I go through and I load that tendon, for example, because if I've twisted my ankle and maybe I have a tendon ligament, now I've got inflammation that's potentially within that tendon ligament. If I pull it to the end range and I'm just holding it there, what's happening is I'm squeezing that tissue. As I squeeze that tissue, the way that our tissues work, they're viscoelastic. They have water in them or fluid in them, whether it's inflammatory fluid or just normal, just fluid within the tissue. As I pull on it, the fluid gets removed from the tissue. That's what we do when we pull. Every time we pull on the tendon or every time we pull on a ligament, it loses fluid. So if you want to get rid of the fluid component, which is causing some of the pain, because what it's doing is increasing the pressure in the tissue. The pressure in the tissue is going to cause our little sensory organ within our tendon, our Golgi tendon organ. It's going to cause it to start going, hey, there's a lot of tension here. And it's going to make us feel, and we're going to interpret that signal from the Golgi tendon organ as pain. What it's doing is telling us there's tension. If I warm up that tissue, the reason why tendinopathies tend to get a lot better when we start to exercise and we get into the exercise and suddenly the pain goes away, a lot of that's because the Golgi tendon organ, we've squeezed out some of the liquid, there's less tension within the tissue, there's less pressure within the tissue, and the Golgi tendon organ is sensing, oh, there's less pressure, we don't feel any pain anymore. So we don't have to do the rest, compress, all of those types of things, because what we want to do is we want to get slow, controlled movement through there. It's totally going to deal with all of the different things that those other initials are trying to do, but it's going to do it in a way that's going to allow the tissue to have the natural response to an injury. Because when we completely block the natural response to the injury, we don't actually start repairing the tissue.
Okay. Would you, and I know this is controversial, but there are practitioners out there who apply heat during that acute phase. Would you recommend that?
I don't think what we're doing when we're applying heat or we're applying cold or we're doing that's got much less to do with the actual physiology of what's going on in the tissue. It's got much more to do with, oh, that feels good. And that feels like it's better. That's got a place. It's got a very important place because the person feels better because it feels like, oh, it's warm. It's warm and I can feel like I maybe have a little bit more range of motion. I can get the same thing by doing a light exercise with that same joint. Because as I'm doing the light exercise, that joint is going to produce, it's going to have energy. It's going to need energy. It's going to produce energy. And every molecule of ATP we're producing seven units of heat with that. So we're inefficient. We produce a lot of heat. So if we just do movement, we're going to actually warm up that area using our own body and our body engine. Sorry.
Okay. So the notion of applying heat to increase blood flow to potentially help with removal of inflammatory substances and whatnot, no evidence around that?
I don't know how extensive the evidence is for a tendon or a ligament.
Okay.
Simply because there's almost no blood flow to a healthy tendon or ligament. Even after an injury, there's almost no blood flow there. One of the ways that you can actually map chronic tendinopathy is by looking for blood supply. You can use a Doppler ultrasound, and the tendon's never supposed to have blood flow. So if it has a lot of blood flow, that's a bad sign. So if I'm going to put heat on a tendon, it's not going to increase blood flow. It'll increase blood flow to the skin around that tendon, but it's not going to increase blood flow into the tendon itself. The blood flow the tendon is getting is usually coming from the fat pad that's associated with, that helps to prevent the injury. And that's one of the things that causes the inflammation. When we're overdoing it, we're compressing the fat pad a lot. We get inflammation there. And that's an area where we have lots of blood flow, but it's also where we're getting our inflammatory cytokines from. And now if I'm going to increase blood flow to that fat pad, maybe all I'm doing is raising the inflammatory substances as well. So I don't think there's any great evidence one way or the other for any of it. If we go through kind of the first principles, what we would say is that if I can get load through there, that's going to have much better effect than rest, than ice or heat. It's just going to give me a much better outcome.
I
Yeah, and
think,
then
sorry, Scott, I think a big thing, like to clarify, right? Keith isn't saying that when you go sprain your ankle to then go run a marathon, right? We're talking
I was just
controlled,
about to say
slow
that. Yeah.
load. We're talking, pain-free, very, on a scale of 0 to 10, you're at 1, maybe 2 of pain. We're not talking just push through the old
Right.
classic, I'm going to tough it out.
Yeah, and we're not talking about heavy load at this point in time, are we?
No,
We're talking about very small amounts of load, and that's
exactly.
progressive over time. So, okay, so we've looked at that acute period. Oh, just actually one other question about the acute period. Would you ever recommend taking a short course of anti-inflammatories?
I wouldn't, and the only reason is there's nice research out of Michael Kerr's group that where they gave actually high doses of anti-inflammatories. They took biopsies from the patellar tendon. They're one of 2 labs in the world that takes tendon biopsies. They analyzed the tendon biopsies and they didn't see any of the genes that are associated with those anti-inflammatories that are supposed to be turned on or turned off that were changed in the tendon. And so what that suggests is that the anti-inflammatories aren't actually getting to the tendon tissue because it's just what we're taking isn't being targeted to the tendon very well. Again, because it doesn't have a lot of blood flow, so it's going to go to other places. There's going to be lots in the kidney. There's going to be other places where it goes. It doesn't seem to get well targeted to tendon tissue. So maybe if I was to use some of the anti-inflammatory creams, if I have something like a patellar tendon or Achilles tendon, maybe I get it to be more directionally in that area. But again, I don't think there's good evidence that it actually gets to the place that we want it to get to.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. It was certainly something that we would tend to err towards and side towards is actually topical anti-inflammatories if it was required at that point, just because the thinking was it was more directed. And so it sort of made sense. It's not as systemic. It's sort of more a local application. And, short term seem to, whether it's placebo or not, but certainly seem to have some impact. Okay, so we go beyond acute. And I guess a lot of athletes will have heard the term eccentrics, and eccentric loading was definitely very much in vogue. Probably call it 2006 to 2015, where a lot of the research was coming out. It came out Håkan Alfredsson out of Sweden, who I had the pleasure of meeting and spending time with. I guess he was leading the charge in eccentrics at the time. And Keith, I think you gave a very good explanation of how he came up with that sort of regime. Do you want to just enlighten us on that?
Yeah, so this is a story that I picked up from the Finns because they knew him really well, and they were telling the story that he was a researcher, medical background, and he knew that people who rupture their Achilles actually tend to have better outcomes in the long term than the people who had chronic, partial tears or tendinopathy of the Achilles. And so he thought, well, what I'll do is I'll just rupture my Achilles. So what he did is he put a ton of weight on his shoulders, and he did these eccentric loads to try and rupture the Achilles tendon. And what he found, because his one big mistake in this is he went slowly rather than quickly. So if he'd done the same thing but done it quickly, he probably would have ruptured his Achilles. But what he did was he moved it slowly. And when he did it slowly and he did it enough times, he started feeling better. And so he thought, oh, this is great. I figured out a way to cure tendinopathy. And sure enough, it works if you can do a big load, if you do it the way that he does, but it has nothing to do necessarily with the load. It has nothing to do necessarily with the eccentric component. It has to do with the speed component. And that's really what he discovered indirectly. He still probably wouldn't describe it as that I'm controlling the speed. He still thinks it's the eccentric component, but it's really that he does slow eccentrics. Because Michael Kerr has done heavy strength training. Again, heavy strength training means that you're moving the weight slowly, and that improves tendinopathy. And so we look at that and say, okay, well, they're both moving really slowly. So maybe it's the slowly and not the heavy or the concentric or eccentric. So the slowest movement is to not move at all. And that's where we started going into isometric work.
Yeah, and then just probably we should cover that an eccentric. If we just want to just outline what an eccentric movement is versus a concentric versus an isometric, it's probably really good. Alec, do you want to just give us those as sort of maybe visual explanations?
Yeah.
Just so
So, I mean, the easiest thing for anyone is to think of your bicep, right? And so if I'm trying to do a bicep curl, if I'm picking up my weight and I'm curling my arm up and moving my fist towards the top of my arm, that's that concentric shortening motion, right? Eccentric is now just I'm going back down, but I'm under control. So this is the big thing is I'm not just dropping the weight, I'm controlling the weight down. So there is muscle tension, but I'm elongating, right? And I'm going down. And then isometrics is, as Keith said, there is no movement. So it'd be if I'm holding my weight, I have my arm at whatever position it may be, and I'm not moving. My muscle's contracting, so there's force. It's taking the energy to keep it there, but it's not physically moving. There's no shortening or lengthening of the muscle.
yeah, perfect explanation. And it's funny, actually, just before we move on from Håkan, I did have the pleasure of actually spending some time in Sweden with him in a tiny little town right up north of Sweden. And I had a professional rugby player with me who'd had an ongoing Achilles tendon injury. And unfortunately, it had multiple corticosteroid injections into it. Håkan decided to open him up on his table. I mean, it was so Swedish. He just literally was like, I think we need to have a look. And he just did local and just opened him up. And there was just a heap of white chalk all through the tendon. He also had a small tear. Sorry, I won't say rupture. He debrided on the table. I mean, it was crazy watching it. This guy was England captain. He debrided it, stitched him up, and then I don't think he didn't put him in a boot. And again, so forward thinking, we were like, well, what do we need to do? And he said, okay, today, next 24 hours, you just don't do anything. You rest, pretty much just like you're on crutches and that. And then he said, from then on, you just start loading and start moving and he'll get on with it. And we were like, is that it? They're the only restrictions? And he was like, yep, let's do it. And, to Hawkins' credit, I mean, Lewis came back. I mean, he came back, I think, I want to say it was something like 8 to 12 weeks, and he was back playing full rugby. And it was quite miraculous, in my opinion, of how effective he was with his approach. Yes, we did a lot of these isometrics early on.
And so one of the big things there is Alec talked about the acute injury. You've got damage there. Now, what happens that causes the chronic is that what we need in order for us to fix that acute injury is we need load to get through that injured area. Because we know that when there's a strong tendon beside it, that weak area that's had some damage to it doesn't feel any of the load, because I always give the example of if I'm going to do a tug of war and it's me and the rock on the same side and we have both two ends and somebody else is pulling against us, I'm not really contributing much because the rock is so bloody strong that all of the load is going to go through his part of our rope. And so that's what's happening when we have these acute small injuries. And so what he was doing when he was debriding, he's basically cutting the healthy part of the tissue. When he does that is basically like, beating up the rock. So he can't take a ton of the load anymore. And so now the injured part of the tendon, has to take on more of the load. And so that's the kind of thing that works. So in racehorses, they used to do it by injecting a drug that would make the healthy part of the tissue not stiff and strong anymore. And so what would happen is that as the horse would walk around, it can't shield the injured area anymore. And so the injured area gets healthy again. So there's all kinds of ways that you can do this. And it's all based on this idea that, and this is basically what we do when we put somebody into an immobilizer. We put them into a mobilizer, that's shielding the tendon from any of the load. And so now what's happening is we're making the rest of the tendon so weak that when you take off the boot, you can't shield the injured part as well anymore. And so I get more load through the injured part. But it takes me 8 weeks to come back from the boot because I've made the tendon really poor. So what I can do is I can do everything that's involved with either debriding or pithing or injecting these substances or by putting you into a boot, but I can start today and I can just do that by loading properly so that we don't get that stress shielding that's causing the long-term injury in the tendon.
You mentioned stress shielding. Do you want to? I know you gave a good description of that. Can you just explain that a little bit further? Because I think the stress shielding is really important in terms of that, how the tendon is becoming painful and maybe not repairing despite, some treatment being applied if it's not the correct treatment.
Absolutely. So stress shielding is basically a principle where if there's a strong thing together with something that's weaker and they're in parallel, if I pull on both of them at the same time, the weak thing isn't going to feel anything. So let me give you an analogy. If I have a small piece of thread and I pull on the small piece of thread, everybody knows it's going to just tear. But now if I take that same small piece of thread and I put it together, exact same length of a piece of wire, now when I pull on them, I can pull on them a lot harder. And as I pull on them, the small piece of thread doesn't tear. The reason that the small piece of thread doesn't tear at that point is because it's not taking any load, because all of it's going through that much stronger piece of wire. So we actually see this a lot in surgeons who like to make really good, strong surgical repairs. They'll use wire reinforced sutures, and that's going to cause a problem later. We see this in bone is classical, because if you get a hip replacement for your bone, the hip prosthetic is made of metal that's 2 orders of magnitude stiffer than the bone material that surrounds it. The reason that you have to get a new hip after 10 years isn't because the metal is broken down, because the metal is super strong. What happens is it's taking all the load. So when your only reason for existence is to take on load as a bone cell, if something else comes in and takes on load, well, you've got no reason to be there anymore. So you shrink away and you atrophy. So you lose bone from all around the prosthetic, and then the prosthetic starts to move within the little hole that you've made in the bone. And so now I have to take that prosthetic out and put in a bigger one. So that's stress shielding. When your sole purpose as a cell is to sense load and then produce collagen in a specific relation to that load, if you don't feel any load, you're like, hey, it's vacation. None of us are very effective when we're on vacation because, yeah, I'm not doing any work. Yeah, it's vacation. I don't know what work to do. I'm just going to sit here and I'm just going to change my shape. Because when I go on vacation, I change my shape. I get a lot bigger, a little heavier, all of those things that happen. That's kind of what happens to these cells. They don't feel it. They don't have to go to work. Somebody else is doing the job. I'm just going to sit here and eat bonbons and get big and fat. That's basically what happens to the cells within the scar.
And so if I'm hearing that, and that's probably the nice segue into how isometrics can help someone, is that it's give and take. It's loading the cells in a way that makes them effective and makes them believe that they've got to do their job, and then taking away, so give them a rest and then give them some more and then take away. Is that a decent way of, in a very simplistic way of describing why or how you can apply isometrics without necessarily causing further damage, but actually starting to heal the tendon?
Exactly. So what we do whenever we hold a tendon under tension is that if I pull and I hold it, what's going to happen is the tension within that tendon is going to go down, and it goes down exponentially, which means that if I just do a heavy, slow movement, I'm already seeing a little bit of that decrease in stiffness of the tendon. If I hold that for longer, I see more of a tendon stiffness decrease in the healthy part of the tendon. So as that healthy part of the tendon stiffness goes down, what happens is the scar area becomes stiffer than the healthy area because the healthy area is relaxing. And now what happens is the load goes through the scar, and now the cells within the scar can sense it. Okay. So it's like if we go back to the analogy with the rock, we're doing our tug of war, but if the rock has really, really bad endurance and he starts getting gassed really quickly, now as his strength goes down really quickly, what's going to happen is I am going to have to take on more of the load for our tug of war team to be successful. Because I can now feel that there's tension in the rope because it's not all going to the strong person, Now I have to do something. And when I do that as a cell that's in a tendon, now I get all these signals. First of all, I get a signal of, oh, the load is coming from there. And so what Alec was saying, when in a scar, when you're making the scar, collagen just goes everywhere, all different directions. What we do when we get that tension, that tensional force, is now the cells, they actually turn. Tendon cells turn so that they're aligned with the line of force. And now they're going to produce collagen in a very directionally oriented way. They're all going to produce it in the same way. And now what you're going to get is you're going to start to build healthy tissue again. And that's what happens when you get that stress relaxation. The healthy part relaxes. The signal now can get to the injury, the cells within the scar. They now know that they have to do a job. They get up off of their vacation. They come back and they start doing their job, and they start making collagen again in the right direction.
And it's the direction of the collagen being laid down that's very important, isn't it? And that is related to the direction of the force. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So that's why having the hold for a longer period of time allows them to get that directional cue of which way to make the collagen. And that's what they really need.
And I guess then athletes are thinking, okay, well, I need to apply load. I potentially need to use an isometric. But there are different ways of applying isometrics. And you mentioned duration of hold. So if we were starting off, and probably let's think patella tendon and Achilles tendon, because that's probably the majority of tendons that are being injured in endurance athletes that we deal with. You know, if someone, you know, they're past that very acute stage, but they're coming into, okay, well, I need to start to rehabilitate this. And, you know, it's day 4 after this particular injury. They've been excluded from any significant tears or anything like that. Potentially they've had some imaging done, whether it's an MRI or an ultrasound, but it is, you know, an acute tendon injury. Where do we start? And how do you define those? I've heard you talk previously about describing the 2 types of isometrics. Could we go through where we would start with an acute injury and how you'd describe that versus then moving down as we progress through the rehabilitation process?
Yeah, so if we go back and we start with Alec's analogy of you twisted your ankle, that one's a ligament one. But say you've gone out and you've run a little bit too far, and now you've got an Achilles tendon problem. Okay, yeah. So what I would do is I wouldn't wait out the 42 to 72 to 96 hours. I would start loading immediately. We have people now come out of surgery and start loading immediately. So we're not giving a long period of time before we start load. When we do that, what we want to do is we want to load, as Alec said before, in a very controlled manner. So we do what's called, very early on in the process, we do what's called low jerk isometrics. So in the first couple of days after your injury or after your surgery, what you do is you decrease jerk. And that means that you slowly apply load to the tissue. So that means you don't just grab the bar and pull and do any type of isometric. What you do is you slowly apply load. So that means you build the load over a 3 to 5 second period up to a point, as Alex said before, of maybe 1 out of 10 on a pain schedule. So what you want to do is maybe there's generalized soreness, but there's no point specific pain. So we're loading that over that 3 to 5 second period. And then we're going to hold it at that tension, whatever tension we were able to get at that time. And we're going to hold that out for maybe 30 seconds. And then we're going to let it off slowly over 3 to 5 seconds again. By doing that, I can load right after the injury. Because now what the important thing for injury is the rate of change of acceleration, which we call jerk. So if I do a quickly move into the position, that's jerk. If I slowly move into that position, that minimizes the jerk. So I can do that from the beginning.
With that, if you talk about that load specifically, what sort of exercises would you be applying in that sort of acute period for an Achilles tendon?
For the Achilles, there are 2 really important ones. One, and they're both basically toe presses. So one is done with a straight leg, one is done with a bent leg. So you can, everybody knows if you're just standing there and you go up on your toes, that's our straight leg toe press. Okay. Immediately after injury, you maybe aren't able to go up on your toes without help, so you can use your other leg. You can balance yourself and pull yourself up. The load is not the important thing, especially early on, because the tissue is weakened. It doesn't need a lot of load. We just need to hold it for a while so that the proper amount of load gets through the injured parts. Okay. And so you do that in both the bent knee and the straight leg position. And that's going to be key.
And when you talk about that, in terms of load, I mean, are you tending to recommend, say, a pain as a scale to quantify that load, or do you use things? I remember we used to use like even just bathroom scales to sort of say, okay, I want you to apply 10% of your body weight to the affected limb and start with that. Like, do you tend to recommend systems like that? I mean, that's a very basic one. I imagine your actual device is probably a little bit more sophisticated, but simple things like that for people who don't have access. Is that how you tend to recommend the loading?
So what we do is we say, especially early on, what you do is you go to pain. And so Dave Power is doing some work now when you do rehabilitation, if you're above the pain threshold versus below the pain threshold. And so he's looking at that directly. And we think that being below the pain threshold is actually something that's pretty important. And so different people have perceived pain differently. So we say, 0 for our professionals. For the, my nephews here, he's redhead. They have different sensation of pain. They feel pain more. So we might say up to 1 or 2 for him, because he's going to feel things that are it feels more painful to him. So we all know individuals they feel pain at the wind blows, that hurts. Those people maybe will go up to 2, but the people who are like, oh, you can't hurt me. Yeah, we're going to stay at 0. We use that as the key component. We just don't want any pain. We want this tissue to not be feeling much there. And then as we progress, what we're looking to do is we're looking to use measurement of force as a way to help the athlete know that they're progressing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I can remember, and again, it was probably rudimentary, but we would always use like a 2 out of 10 pain. But, and again, your point being that some people do have very high pain thresholds, and we did often see that there was differences in responses to how that happened, especially with pro athletes, because I think, as you say, the pain tolerance is a lot higher in that population. Do you, when you're talking about these, I have heard you reference them as overcoming and yielding. So where do we sit with these two descriptions? And can you describe overcoming isometrics versus yielding and how they fit into the sort of this progression of rehabilitation?
Yeah, so overcoming isometrics are basically when you're pushing against an immovable object. So I'm going to say take the pin out of the leg extension machine and put it down at the bottom. So I've got the whole stack of weight. Now I'm going to push with my left leg. And I can't produce enough force with my left leg to lift it. And as soon as I strike to push, I'm trying to overcome all of that weight. A yielding isometric, now what we're going to do is same machine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put less weight, lift it with both legs, and then I'm going to go down to a position and I'm going to hold it with just the left. And I'm going to try and hold it in that position for a period of time. So the yielding means you're trying to prevent it from dropping after already lifting. The overcoming means that you're trying to push it and lift it, but you're not going to be able to move it.
Okay. So the overcoming would be safer, I guess, because the person is in control of how much force they can apply, as opposed to yielding, where the force is sort of an external force. Would that be correct?
Potentially, but if I know exactly what the force is, because it's a yielding isometric and I've put on, say, 100 kilos onto my leg extension, and I know that I can lift that with 2 legs and then I can bring it to a spot and hold it, I know I've still got 100 kilos there. If I'm doing an overcoming isometric, until right now, you can push as hard as you want. And if you're really strong, you push 300 kilos there. I don't know what you can do. But what the problem with the overcoming ones is that you can't just by, if I'm going to push against a wall, I don't know how hard I'm pushing. And so right now, that's the limitation with the overcoming isometrics, is that I don't know how much force I'm putting into that. The yielding isometrics, I know that, say I'm going to do something and I'm at home, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Alec's bicep example. I'm going to take 3 cans of soup and I'm going to put it into a bag and I'm going to hold it in the mid substance, I know exactly what the weight is. It's those 3 cans of soup. If I were to instead grab the underside of a table that weighs, 200 pounds, and I do the same movement, I'm still doing an isometric, but I don't know how much weight I'm pushing at that point. I don't know how much load is going through that tissue. And that's a really important thing, because you have no way to quantify that. And you have no way to know if you're progressing, and if no way to know if you're doing the right weight at that point.
Okay, but and again, I may have this around the wrong way, but you would be starting with overcoming and using a pain to try and quantify the amount of force that they're starting with versus applying a big external sort of yielding load. Would that be correct?
Yeah, because what we're trying to do when we do the overcoming is we're not going to use load as the outcome initially. We're
Using
just
pain.
saying, go until you feel tension across the tissue, but there's no pain.
Yeah.
And that's the key. That's the keying that we give. That's exactly what we tell the individuals. I want you to, when we've done this with rock climbers, with the below body weight rock climbing, these are called no hangs, where you kind of just put your fingers up above your door jamb, for example, and you just put some load onto it. All we say is, we want you to feel tension across the tissue with no pain.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're looking at there. So we use pain, especially early in the rehabilitation process.
So I imagine the issue, it comes, as you say, you're in that very early acute period. So someone's, let's say, an Achilles tendon, and you're using pain as a scale. They start doing these overcoming straight knee, bent knee, single leg stands, maybe with assistance, and they're using pain. Things start improving, but now pain may be not such an issue, but now you're trying to understand how much load is going through with those overcomings. How do we, is it just therefore then a progression to yielding, although my understanding is yielding will create different stress on the tendon, or is this where your device is trying to bridge that gap between that sort of we won't call it subacute, but that sort of, let's think about it, that middle, early to mid stage rehabilitation? Is that what you're trying to?
Yeah, and Alec can probably speak to that better.
Yeah, it for me, it always kind of makes me laugh to think that this is athletics, and it's multi-billion-dollar industry, the healthcare system, and the impact of tendon and ligament injuries on the healthcare system. And we have Keith, who's an expert in the field, and people come to him and ask for, what can I do? And then we're saying, hey, let's take things that aren't designed for tendon and ligament, and let's use them to target them, because that's the best we can do right now, right? Let's take a frying pan and rotate it so that we can target the inner or the outer elbow. As we mentioned, let's pull up on a countertop. I don't know what that force equals. I just know I'm pulling up on a countertop and I'm not moving.
Let's use bathroom scales for an athlete worth $60 million. I mean, it's hilarious, isn't it?
Exactly.
I mean, we used to laugh at the stuff that we used to apply, and it's like, this is where we've got to, guys. still in the Egyptian hieroglyphic stage.
I think back to when I joined this lab and thought of the world of professional sports as, this higher level of being and thinking, and then come to find, working with Keith, again, there's $60 million guys that are using frying pans, right? Because there's
so far from it. Yeah.
Our goal is really two things with our devices, right? The first is to kind of remove that idea of we're using suboptimal devices to target a tendon. We want to say, here's the device. It is meant to target the inside of your elbow. It is meant to target the UCL. It's meant to target the outside of your elbow. Or we're going to just get load across the Achilles, right? So we're specifically targeting our specific area of injury. That's our first goal. So whether you are a professional athlete who has an entire team around you that can make sure you're doing it right, or if you're just an aging individual who's at home and you like to play 18 holes of golf once a week and suddenly your elbow's starting to hurt, you have no training experience, you can take this device and train with it without prior experience, right? Simplify it. It's specific. And then the other one is what we just kind of talked to, that limitation with overcoming, is this idea of, can we perform an overcoming isometric and actually measure the load that we're putting through, right? Through our device. So we're not measuring the exact load through the tendon, but it's through our device. So we're giving a quantifiable outcome as you're doing isometric holds to say, look, when I go maximal for a few seconds, this is what I get. Now I want to go down to sub-maximal, and I want to hold that for 30 seconds. And over time, I'm finding, maybe every couple of weeks I redo a max and I find, okay, I'm progressing. So now I'm actually able to see my progression over time. And that's, kind of filling that gap that you talked about, Scott, where at what point am I putting more pressure? Am I overcoming? At what point, how do I know what I'm doing? That's the second goal of our device, is to be able to say, now you can track it. And so now you know the progress that you're making. And maybe now you finally have reached the point where we would introduce the yielding isometrics and saying, now let's get a leg press and increase the weight to a point of, we're willing to kind of risk some of the potential risks that come with that.
And I mean, can you describe the actual device? Because in my head, I'm thinking, okay, is it like a manual muscle tester where it's either a strain or a push type thing, and you're quantifying in newtons? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah.
Or?
So we're still, working in unison with our tech transfer office.
Yeah.
So, they would be upset. We're academic, so we would love to just share it all, but we have, been advised we can't share specific details. But the idea is that, as you're performing whatever hold that you're doing, you're getting a readout of the load that you're doing, paired with an app or a device if, you're not someone that's using a mobile phone. And that's the goal of the device, is that it's instrumented to where there's a portion that targets the specific tendon, and then we have a device that measures the load. And we can get that readout and kind of gamify rehab to the point of, I'm shooting for this load and I'm doing my absolute best to maintain this load. Oh, every couple of weeks I get to find out how much stronger I've gotten. And now I get to do it again and kind of hold and hold and hold and increase.
Yeah. And so the idea also is that you can then now use it as a training device where we're going to shorten the length of the holds, because as your tissue gets better, as you can produce more force, now we don't need to do the long holds that are designed to fix injuries. Now what we do is we do the shorter loads, and we're going to get it to the point where we can do those short, quick isometrics that are great to do right before you get back into doing all of your on-field, all of those kind of return to play type of thing. We're going from that transition point of the long isometric holds to something that becomes more athletic. Those things you can also do within that space. And so you can do it, across different joints, across different tendons, with the idea that you can quantifiably measure this. And this is what I did yesterday. Can I do a little bit better today?
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. What is the name of the company? Can you supply that at least so people can take a look, and we can certainly put that into the show notes?
It is Sinuous, SINEWUS.
Excellent. So what does that stand for?
So it's, you could explain it, Keith.
So sinew is tendon or ligament. So when you say that athlete's sinewy, so that was the sinew, and the sinuous was just us, or US was maybe United States. We weren't really necessarily thinking too much beyond the sinew component.
Yeah, I like it. Oh, no, it sounds fascinating, and I'm sure.
But the reason that Alec is here is because I always just splurt out things, and then the tech transfer comes back and says, "Oh, now you can't actually patent that." Like,
yeah, okay,
well, that was a waste.
Well, look, I think a lot of practitioners and a lot of athletes are probably very interested in that product, because as I've said, and as you're saying, I mean, it is literally still in the dark ages, I think, unfortunately, rehab. And that's why I think you see, depending on the practitioner, these varying results as well with tendon rehabilitation, the skill of the practitioner, and it's just a skill, I think, in terms of, and that's often led from, a lot of mistakes along the way, unfortunately, but that's generally what makes a good practitioner who can handle sort of tendon rehabilitation. I think if we can standardize that and allow, athletes and practitioners maybe who don't have a good understanding but can easily see load applied and how to progress that, I think that's a definite move in the right direction. So, good work on getting that done.
One other thing that I want to really stress is that when people have a more mature tendinopathy that kind of comes and goes but is reactive, we like to do the load in the evening the first time. Just do a couple, maybe 3 loads through the tendon, 3 isometric holds, sub pain threshold. Again, what the reason we like to do it in the afternoon is because into the evening, then they're going to relax. You'll wake up the next morning. You want to know whether it's become reactive. Did it hurt more at that point? And if it did have a reactive, if it was reactive to the strength training, then we're going to actually have to dial it back more. And that's really where it really helps if we can quantify the force. Because if I don't know what you did yesterday and it hurt it, I can't help you produce less force today to make it get better.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. With and you talk about how you would apply it in the evening. In a very general framework, how long are you recommending applying a load in the early stages? And how many repetitions, how many sets, and how do they then know when to progress that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So basically, this is where a lot of our research has been going, and what we know from a lot of work that we've done and other people have done, is that these connective tissues, like our tendons, ligaments, and bones, they actually they become immune to the signal. They become what we call refractory. So if you think of it like your toilet, one exercise bout is like flushing the toilet. And so what the interesting thing is with our tendons, ligaments, cartilage, and bone is that they become refractory much sooner than our skeletal muscle or our heart does. So if we do an hour run, our heart and our skeletal muscle is getting an hour's worth of signal to adapt. If we instead look at our tendons, ligaments, cartilage, they got 10 minutes of signal to adapt, but they got 60 minutes of wear and tear. So the signal for our tendons, ligaments, cartilage, and bone happens really short. So in bone, the shortest period I've seen is 4 loads. So this Japanese group had girls jump as high as they could 4 times a day, 3 days a week, and they increased bone mass. There's a scientific group that loaded the tibia of actually the forearm of mice, and they found that 40 loads gave you the maximal stimulus for bone adaptation. So that's one thing. That's one component of it. So we don't need many loads, and our work has shown that within 10 minutes, it doesn't matter if I've done 100 loads or 10 loads. After 10 minutes, the tendon cells they've tuned out to the load. So what we want to do is what we talk about is we use these 4 30-second isometrics with 2 minutes of rest in between, because that gives us 2 minutes of load, but it's over an 8-minute period. And that's really maximizing what we call the maximal effective dose of exercise. So if we're going to do those 4 30-second isometric holds with 2 minutes of rest, that's going to give us all the load that we need for that tissue. If we want to do more, and we've done an evening session, we wake up the next day and it still feels fine, we can actually do a morning session and an evening session. That's totally fine. It takes about 8 hours for our body, for the cells within our tendons, ligaments, and cartilage to be able to signal again. And you see this in elite athletes like Camille Herron, who's the world's best ultramarathon runner. She actually doesn't run singles; she runs doubles, and she does that because she actually got a master's degree in bone mechanobiology, and she figured out, oh, look, if I load it 8 hours apart, I get 2 stimuli from the same thing that everybody else is getting 1 stimulus. And that means my tendons, ligaments, and bones are going to be stronger than the people who are doing 1 session a day. And she's been really, really good. We'll touch wood. She's been really good at being injury free. And she's run her career. I think she says that she's run over 150,000 miles or something like this, because she's been able to run continuously because she's done it in these 2 sessions. So you can apply these kind of rules of shorter periods of activity with these 8-hour rests in between are really good for all of these connective tissues.
Yeah, okay. So, and I mean, a lot of people will hear that and go 30 seconds of load with 2 minutes of rest. Is that really going to be enough? I mean, I can tell personally that it makes a huge difference. And I think one of the big things, and again, I've heard you talk about this, is don't be all macho, especially for men in that rehabilitation process. Like, it's not about smashing it with the most load possible. Actually, it's probably so much less. And just describe what an athlete, like say we've got no pain or very minimal pain, but they still have this tendon that's grumbly. It feels stiff. And I think that's probably,
Yep.
it's that stiffness with a little bit of pain, and you're just like, this just is not working well. What should the athlete feel when they are doing these 30-second sort of holds?
Yeah, perfect. So this is exactly, so the climbing research that we did is with this guy, Emil Abrahamson, who's, again, another Swede. And his brother, Felix, wasn't able to climb anymore because he always had injury. And the climbers have a great word for it, and they call it tweaky. So their fingers are tweaky, and it's not working right. And so
Is that
he
the squeakiness? They get squeaky tendons as well, or not?
they just call it tweaky. So
Okay.
they don't work right. They don't feel like they can make a fist. They don't feel like they're working properly.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what we all feel like. That person with the bum knee, it's just that it's a little tweaky, and it does these things, and it doesn't move quite right. And so Felix was the one who adapted our research that talked about 10 minutes of loading with these longer holds to rock climbing. And so he basically did what we talked about, which is I just want to feel tension across this. The load that I put on it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I do a big movement or a small movement. I just need to get tension through there. And so again, what you're doing is I just want to feel that it's tight, that I can feel, in that case, the tendons of my flexors I can feel load going through them. And we all can do that. Like if you do a leg extension or a squat, you can feel when the tension is going through that patellar tendon. If I go up onto my toe just a little bit and I'm going up on 2 feet, but I'm maybe going to shift onto one leg and I can feel the tension going through that tendon, that's all we're looking for. We don't need lots and lots of load. And again, as you said, the biggest problem that we get into with people is twofold. One is that there's an analgesic effect of isometrics. And this is stuff from Jill Cook and Melanie Rio, or Ebony Rio, down in Australia. And they had shown that if you do isometrics, you get, for most people who've got problems with the tendons, there's like 3 to 5 hours of pain. There's decreased pain within the tendon. And so that's why a lot of professional athletes will do that in their prehab or in their activation before they go and play. That's great. It also means that as we do these isometrics, we're going to feel a lot better. Our athletes are pain-free a lot of them are pain-free within 2 weeks. The problem is the tissue isn't fixed yet, but they're pain-free. So what they do is they stop doing the loading anymore. And so now what happens is they're going to not continue to get the stimulus through that scar. You've gotten rid of the pain because you've reorganized a little bit, but it's not fixed yet. It takes about 8 weeks for the tissue to be completely regenerated or repaired. And so what you have to do is you have to get your athletes to commit to going through the full 8-week period. What we do is we say that it's a lot like antibiotics. If you're feeling crappy and you take the first 2 antibiotics, you suddenly feel great. But if you stop the antibiotics, that's not good. It's going to give you antibiotic resistance. So we need you to finish the course. So finish the course of antibiotics. What we're saying is you got to finish the course of your loading as well. I want you to load every day for 8 weeks. And that's going to give us that full course that's going to actually repair the tissue, not just make it feel better. That's when a lot of clinicians and a lot of people stop doing the work. What we have to do is we have to get it to the point where the tissue is actually healthy again. And that takes that longer period of time, that 8-week period.
I think that's always the real challenge, isn't it? Because unfortunately, you have pain, you get dysfunction, and people then, and you get altered biomechanics and things. But when you take away the pain, people automatically assume that everything else is going to sort of rectify itself, but it's not. You have to go through that process of full rehabilitation to address the tissue and also the biomechanical issues that were caused by the pain initially. But it's a tough ask. And I wonder where devices like yours that can maybe show left versus right and differences, even though you're pain-free, still show that, hey, you're not as strong or you're not able to develop the force as well in the affected versus unaffected limbs. I think that's where it could be a real game changer for athletes, but also practitioners to create that buy-in approach.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's really important also to say that over that 8-week period, it doesn't mean that you have to just do those isometrics. You're continuing to,
Oh,
when you're getting back, you're still doing your rehabilitation. We're just doing those daily isometrics because what we need is we need a signal to that one area where we've got those cells that are on vacation. We need to get them that signal every single day to know, for them to know that they need to come to work, they need to do their job. Yeah, I'm going to train. Like our case study with a professional basketball player, he played 50 games. He practiced every other day, basically, but he still did 3 times a week. He did his isometric loading and he filled in that hole within his patellar tendon. It's not that we have to stop everything else. It's that we have to do these associated exercises. Because remember, when we're stress shielding that injured area, all of the training that you're doing, because you're loading quickly, it's not going to the scar. So the only time the scar actually gets its 10 minutes of work is from doing the specific targeted exercise.
yeah, it's the concurrent rehab. I think, and again, it's the concurrent rehabilitation that's the difficulty, and it's, and I guess again, for people just when you're listening to this, yes, isometrics play a very important role, especially in the early period, but they also play that important role to facilitate the much more complex rehabilitation, more sports specific movements, which of course have to happen in thorough rehabilitation. Like you will be doing plyometrics, you will be doing proper strength loading, whether it's with machines or free weights, but the isometrics are an adjunct to continue to allow you to do all that as you progress. And yeah,
Exactly. You're never going to be an elite athlete if you're just doing isometrics. You have to
correct.
do a lot of fast movements. You have to do other movements that are going to allow you to perform your sport.
Yeah. So if we just jump a little bit forward with rehabilitation, because obviously we are generally a nutrition-based company, I think what everyone's interested in is collagen. Now, where does collagen fit with the isometrics? Where does it fit in the rehabilitation process? Should someone be immediately, you get a tendon injury, should you be taking, collagen immediately? What type of collagen? How much collagen? And what would your recommendations be?
Sure. So I think of collagen a lot like leucine-rich protein. So Stu Phillips, Luke Van Loon, they're the kind of leaders in that muscle building protein component. And what they'll tell you immediately is you could eat all the leucine-rich protein in the world, and you will not build muscle mass because the exercise is 95% of it. So you have to get the heavy load through the muscle. You have to go to failure. That's going to be the stimulus for the muscle to grow. And then what you do by providing the leucine-rich protein is you give it the extra stimulus, you give it building blocks, and you give it a secondary stimulus that allows you to grow that muscle bigger. We think it's very similar for collagen. So you can take all the collagen you want. If you're not going to do load to get load through the tissue, you might have better looking skin or hair or nails or whatever it is that the beauty companies tell us. It's not going to make you pain free from your tendon issues. So that's the first thing, and that's the most important thing. That collagen is a small part of the repair process. So what we're doing is collagen, dietary collagen can be used to improve the adaptations that we see in both performance but also in tissue. So we've done some performance stuff with our American football team here. If you take collagen when you do heavy strength training, you don't see the decrease in rate of force development. You see better stiffness within the structures, and you see better athletic performance. Rob Erskine's group has shown that if you take collagen associated, dietary collagen associated with your strength training routine, that you get a bigger increase in patellar tendon size. So there's good evidence that it's positive for adaptations with strength training, with other types of training. And then there's only a couple of studies that are actually in the repair space, in the tendinopathy space. And one of them is a crossover double-blinded crossover design study, but the collagen content that they were used was quite small. And so I'm a little bit, even though it was said that collagen was beneficial, that's not the best study. So there's got to be more work done in this area. But again, the most important thing is we're going to get load through the tissue. What we're going to get with the load through the tissue is the signal for the cells to produce more collagen. What the dietary collagen is doing is it's giving just the substrates. So it's giving the building blocks for collagen within our cell. It's not like I'm going to eat collagen and that collagen molecule is going to get stuck into my patellar tendon. What I'm going to do is I'm going to eat collagen And it doesn't matter if it's coming from, say, my grandmother's soup or from whatever source it is. I'm going to get that in. I'm going to break all the collagen down into amino acids, maybe a couple of peptides. Those amino acids are going to circulate around my body. Because, as we talked before, tendons and ligaments don't have a lot of blood flow to them. We like to take the nutrients for tendon and ligament adaptation before we do the training. Just because, as we said before, when I pull on the tendon to move a joint, my muscles pulling on that tendon to bring that bone closer, that's going to squeeze out liquid. If the liquid that it sucks back in when it goes back to relaxed position has more of the building blocks for collagen, more of those amino acids are going to be around so that those cells within the scar can start building the collagen that we want them to. So it's not necessarily that we're looking to say, we've got to get it in immediately before. If ideally we're taking it 30 minutes to an hour before. If you can't do that, you can take it after. Just take it after at the same time every day. Because a lot of what we see is that today, if I do exercise, the peak of collagen synthesis in the tissue that I exercise today is actually tomorrow. So unlike muscle, where it goes up and down pretty quickly, the peak of collagen synthesis in a tendon or a ligament, this is work from Michael Kerr's group, seems to be about 24 hours. So that means that if I took in dietary collagen today, that is associated with my exercise, that's giving me building blocks for the cells that got a signal yesterday. And so what I like to do is I like to take collagen at the same time every day, close to when I'm doing my training. And I'm going to have that collagen be the minimum I would put in is 10 grams. Rob Erskine's work says that 30 grams is better for building. So it's somewhere between those two numbers. We don't have an absolute number yet. I would always do it in association with vitamin C, about 250 milligrams of vitamin C. We're saying a little bit more than we used to say now because it seems to be beneficial. And that's really the core of what we're going to do. So for most people who are training a little, having that 10 grams is going to be fine, especially in the work that I was doing with Luc Van Loon in Maastricht. We were doing a blended protein. So it had whey protein, leucine-rich protein, but that leucine-rich or the dairy protein is really low in glycine, which is really high in tendon collagen. So what we were doing was combining the whey protein with the collagen protein, and that's when we saw an increase in connective protein synthesis within the muscle. And so what we're doing is if you're going to do 10 grams of collagen, just do it with some whey protein. If you want to do more collagen, then you don't need as much of the whey protein. Okay. So those types of blends are really what we're starting to look at more and more, because the leucine component actually can stimulate the cells within the tendon as well as within the muscle.
It's interesting when you think about that. I mean, I'm thinking from an athlete and a practical perspective, taking on a bunch of whey protein potentially before a session. A lot of athletes would probably balk at that because they're sort of like, oh, I just don't want that in my gut. So most would take it afterwards. So I would generally tend to recommend sort of keeping it separate. And I think they just find taking the collagen is a little bit easier, just sort of to stomach, because they can take it with, I mean, we used to use Ribena, but I'd also, I mean, that was based on a very early study where they used a basic gelatin actually and showed
that was our study. Yeah. So
was that yours? Okay.
That was Greg Shaw was the first author on that. So we used Ribena because it gave us about 50 milligrams of vitamin C. That was all we were looking for. We used pure gelatin. So it was just a cooking gelatin that Greg went down to the market and bought.
It's sold all over Australia. That I recommend that brand to a lot of people just to use because it's so cheap. But
so it's dead easy. The thing to remember with collagen is the only negative thing that we can find with collagen is associated with kind of heavy metal content. So if it is something you're taking every day on a decent amount, the source of collagen becomes important because, cows like us, we store heavy metals that come into our body. We put it into our bone as a way to get it out of our system. But then when you make a bone broth or when you make a gelatin, if you're using bones as the source, then you might see heavy metals within that bone broth or the gelatin. So all we do is we'd say, look for something that's maybe coming from a seafood base or is coming from a skin. So if you're doing fish skin or fish-based dietary collagen, that's great. Or if you're doing pig skin or you're doing beef skin, a lot of times now, especially in California, because there are heavy metals in the bone, if you don't have a skin source, they'd make you put a little label onto the collagen to say that it's got things that are known by the state of California to cause cancer.
Yeah,
So
wow.
the ones from skin, they don't have that. And so that's the only thing we tell them. You don't have to get anything special. It doesn't have to, all the pills, all of that stuff. We haven't seen any difference between the gelatin that we used in the first study and any fancy collagens that we've gotten from companies that tell us, oh, this is the best thing ever. You might need to use a lower concentration, and we'd use the lower concentration for them, and it shows nothing. We use the same concentration as the gelatin, and it shows, okay, it looks like the gelatin. There's nothing better about it.
So people should look for either fish skin or bovine or porcine hide as the source. And I mean, my understanding is that marine collagen is more type 1. And is that correct? And bovine is more type 3. Is that correct? And is there a difference there?
It doesn't matter. So the collagens, yes, collagen 3 is in our skin, and collagen 1 is in our tendons, and collagen 2 is in our cartilage. It doesn't matter because, like we said, you're not going to take that piece of collagen and stick it into your cartilage. You're going to break it down into the building blocks, these amino acids. And all of the collagens have the same, or a very similar sequence. Every third amino acid is a glycine. Every third amino acid is a proline that can become hydroxylated. It's only the question as to what the middle amino acid is. But if every third amino acid is glycine or proline, whether I take a type 1 collagen that has lots of that has a third glycines and a third prolines, or I take a type 3 or a type 2 that had the same structure, doesn't really matter. So the majority of the protein is going to be exactly the same. It's going to be glycine or proline.
I think that's a very important point because there's a lot of marketing material around type 1 marine being especially good for skin, the aesthetics versus, say, type 3 and type 2 more for ligament and tendons.
Yeah, so. But the reality is that we're breaking it down in our bodies to the building blocks. Those building blocks, they don't care whether it came from a fancy one that cost $700 an ounce versus the one that you got as a gelatin that cost 30 cents an ounce.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think the weight of the athlete could play a role in the amount of collagen that one would supplement with? So lighter athlete, maybe 10 grams, 15 grams, heavier athletes, sort of maybe 80 plus kilos, supplementing with maybe that 30 grams?
It's possible, but there hasn't been enough data produced that tells us definitively.
How much do you take?
Yeah. How much do you take?
Yeah.
I take about 15 grams in the morning every day, kind of after. I do it after my run or my workout, basically, because I do my endurance in the morning, and I'm not too worried about it getting 100% by getting it an hour before, because I don't really. I'm going out for a run at 6 o'clock in the morning. I don't want to get up at 5 to have my collagen, so I sleep in. I then go out for my run or my bike, and then I come back and I take a collagen with a whey, and that's kind of just the only supplement I take is that combination there.
And I think, look, from a practical standpoint, that makes complete sense. And I think it is a great practical takeaway for athletes. Look, okay, it may not be 100% optimal, especially if you're not talking about an acute or a subacute tendon injury. If you're someone with maybe this more chronic and you are doing the isometrics and other forms of rehab, taking 15, 20 grams in your post-workout shake with good quality whey protein, which has, a good amounts of leucine, could be a very effective and practical solution for them. So I love that. Would you recommend any other sort of nutritional strategies? You mentioned protein there. I think we've covered that. That's good. Or do you count one interesting thing? Because you mentioned, obviously, collagen has a different structure in terms of proline and glycine compared to, and very low leucine content. Do you count that as your total protein intake? I don't know if you actually think about your total protein intake for the
So do I
day.
count the collagen as total protein intake?
Correct.
It's a very low quality protein.
Yeah.
So
Do
it
you
doesn't
count
have a
it or
lot of
not?
essential amino acids and so we see that. I don't count my total protein intake, but I wouldn't necessarily count that as part of my total protein intake, because I don't see it as being like, oh yeah, this is contributing to all of these protein synthetic. Collagen is our most common protein in our body, so it is contributing to a lot of collagen synthesis, but I don't think that it's necessarily considered the same thing as a high quality protein like whey or like anything that you would get from meat or dairy.
Yeah, I tend to recommend it just as a bonus. If you are taking collagen, it's like a supplement. You take
Yeah.
it like if you're taking iron or vitamin D, just take it. Don't have to worry about recording it. Don't count it towards your total protein intake if you are tracking that. And so, yeah, it's interesting to hear that. Other supplements, do you recommend anything in combination? Like, has carbohydrates, the role of carbohydrates been shown to be influential on collagen synthesis?
So carbohydrates important for bone, but
Yep.
we don't know exactly why it's important for bone. So if you're people on a ketogenic diet, like the kids who have epilepsy on a ketogenic diet, they lose bone mass. And so the reason they have to go off that, it's great for their brain, but their bones become extremely brittle. So I don't know whether that is because of the protein component. We think that that's because of the mineral component in the bone. So the bone is made up of collagen as the protein and the mineral. So I don't think that the carbohydrate is playing a big role in the tendon. We don't see it as being an important component. We know that if you have really high fat in your system, that decreases collagen synthesis, but we don't see necessarily that protein is a really important component.
Doesn't the carbohydrate, doesn't it influence the osteoclastic and osteoblastic activity? Isn't that
Yeah.
the premise behind it? And even in very acute,
But it also
less than 24
changes,
hours.
it's also supposed to change the crystal structure in the bone.
Okay.
So it actually changes the mechanics, even if there's the same amount of collagen, or sorry, mineral there.
Yeah,
So
wow.
but that isn't as well studied. The only other thing that we're looking at now is we've got a big natural product screen, and what we identify is a lot of polyphenols are really good for collagen synthesis. And
Can
so
you just describe polyphenols for further
polyphenols
understanding?
are these little circular compounds that are they're micronutrients in a lot of things. And so we tend to use, in our lab, we tend to use epicatechin, which is a polyphenol that you find in dark chocolate, mostly in cocoa. And so the reason we use it is because it's easy for us to get people to take. So you can get lots of polyphenols in like tea, green tea extracts, and they're to the point where they have significant effects. The Mars company here produces epicatechin enriched cocoa that is what they call cocoa via, and that's because they know that it's got a lot of health components in all of these catechins or these polyphenols that you find in it. So it's just stuff that you find in a lot of what we call superfoods. Those superfoods tend to have a fairly high amount of these polyphenols.
So you're giving everyone the okay to consume collagen, but also a decent amount of chocolate and good quality chocolate
Yeah.
at the same
So
time.
what I tend to do is I say when you're taking your supplement, don't use a chocolate flavored supplement, because they put in chocolate that is actually Dutch processed, and when you use the alkali, it kills all the polyphenols. And so all you have to do is just get an unflavored supplement and then put in your own high quality natural cocoa. And now from the same chocolate, you actually get a health benefit that you don't get from having that kind of lower quality. Well, it looks better. The dark chocolate, when you make a cocoa, if it's really dark cocoa, that tells you that it's alkaline treated, and it looks great to make a dessert or a smoothie, but it has none of the health benefits.
Yeah, interesting. And you're saying Mars produces, I would not
I know that
associate Mars as a
they've made
company
it.
to, yeah.
I don't, they're one of the companies that has put a lot of research into epicatechins and polyphenols in general, and
Yeah.
they did identify this, and they make a product called Cocovia, which has lots more polyphenols. It's enriched for the polyphenols.
I can just see now every endurance athlete going out and buying Coco Via.
There's
It
different ways you can do it.
sounds great. No, that's good. Anything else? Any other sort of micronutrients that you would consider? Things like zinc, is that important? Copper, anything like that?
The copper is important just because it's important for cross-linking, but it's not something that we necessarily say that you have to supplement at a high level. But we know that lysyl oxidase, which is the enzyme that puts in a lot of cross-links, it uses copper as a cofactor. So if you're on a lower copper diet, and you can test that by just putting your diet in and getting your dietary recall, look at your copper. If your copper is in the normal range, you're fine. If it's low, then you might think of doing something that would supplement. And then, we use foods like sesame seeds with athletes, and halva, which is a sweet component there. It's a Middle Eastern thing that's made from sesame seeds. That's a good way to get copper if you need to. Or if you like seafood, you can do it that way as well.
I was going to say seafood as well. So
for your Aussies, the seafood is going to be a big one.
Food first approach, but not always food only. Does vitamin D? Last question. Does vitamin D play a role in tendon health?
Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't found any good evidence yet. There are people who have shown that if you get in high quality vitamin D, that you can change collagen synthesis rates, but I haven't seen it at a tissue level to see that it has any effect.
Yeah. No, because I've seen obviously the role in bone health, and then emerging evidence in immunity and whatnot, and I think they're trying to show all sorts of correlations to all sorts of body systems with vitamin D. But yeah, I guess we'll keep our eye out for that. Look, Keith, Alec, I know I've taken a lot of your time. It's been fascinating to hear just all about tendons and the ways in which we can treat them now. And I think what's exciting is it sounds like a lot more research is probably in the woodworks, and more effective treatment and rehabilitation strategies are on the horizon. We will share your company link. I think that's sounds like something that is going to be well received by a lot of athletes and practitioners alike. Look, I think you've covered absolutely everything. I think we'll get a heap of questions probably from this that I'll probably have to field to you. But unless there's anything else you want to add, we'll sign it off there.
All right, perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you for having us.
No,
thanks,
absolute
Alex,
pleasure.
for joining us, even though you're a new dad and you have lots of different things going on.
Yes. Thank you very much, Scott. I'm glad I could contribute in a little bit. A slight break from new fatherhood for a second. Now right back to it.
That's all right. You managed it well. So, look, guys, thank you so much. And we'll chat soon. Thank you.
All right. Good luck with it.